Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Today, talking about an author who, among other things, pretty much invented mystery writing, as well as broadly popularizing both cryptology and cosmology, along with what is frequently termed either macabre or gothic literature, and has had his work adapted into 54 motion pictures and inspired well over 30 additional television incarnations, including, within the late 1960s, the soap opera Dark Shadows, along with references and allusions that have appeared in other TV programs as diverse as The Simpsons and The Sopranos, in addition to Castle and The Gilmore Girls, while also having inspired the name of the professional football team from the city in which he died and was buried, the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. Born in Boston on January 19th in 1809, the second son of actor parents David Poe Jr. and Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins, who had been performing in William Shakespeare's King Lear at the time and may have named their newborn baby boy after the character Gloucester's legitimate son. A year later, with the expectation of additionally supporting a third child, a daughter named Rosalie, Father David abandoned his family and, according to Philip Van Dorn Stern in a 1945 introduction to the Viking Press, Portable Poe, disappeared so completely that no record of his death is known. Then, sadly, Elizabeth died of tuberculosis, the one-year-old Edgar being taken in, although never officially adopted, by a wealthy couple from Richmond, Virginia, John and Frances Allen. As explained by Stern, when Edgar was 6 years old, the family went to England to remain there for 5 years. The boy was sent to private school, his education as a gentleman having begun. However, following a return to the United States, circumstances gradually began to change. To begin, young Edward, at about the age of 17, according to Van Dorn Stern, fell in love with the mother of one of his playmates, Jane Stith Stannard, who died shortly after, just before Master Edgar was sent off to the University of Virginia, where, like many a contemporary college freshman, he began drinking heavily and not being given the same level of financial support as many of his Southern antebellum fellow students, gambling, which then led to an increasing level of debt that subsequently resulted in discord with his foster father, who consequently refused to support him any further. Around the same time, Edgar again fell in love, on this occasion, with a woman his own age from Richmond named Sarah Elmira Royster, whose parents objected to the potential match, ultimately encouraging their dutiful daughter to marry someone else, apparently influencing Mr. Poe to get out of town, leaving his foster parents' home and moving back to the city of his birth in Massachusetts, where he arranged for the publication of a pamphlet titled Tamerlane and Other Poems by a Bostonian that, even at the price of 12.5 cents, sold very few copies and gained little critical recognition. With virtually no other options seeming to be available to him, Poe then joined the United States Army under the assumed name of Edgar A. Harry, where he rose to the rank of sergeant major, but, according to Philip Van Dorn Stern, apparently ashamed of having merely been an enlisted man due to his aristocratic leanings. Later, accounted for the time spent in the army by saying that he had gone abroad to fight in the Greek War of Independence, as had Lord Byron just before his death in 1824. Honorably discharged after 4 years, Poe went to Baltimore, where his older brother, William Henry Poe, had been dying of tuberculosis and alcoholism in the home of their paternal aunt, Mrs. Maria Clem, and her 7-year-old daughter, Virginia. At the age of 21, through the influence of his foster father, Edgar A. Poe was admitted to the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1830, just 1 year after a fellow Virginian named Robert E. Lee had graduated with the distinction of having received no demerits during his 4 years as a cadet. But Poe, by contrast, was very quickly court-martialed for neglect of duty and then expelled in February of 1831. Going to New York and finding a publisher for a volume of verse titled Poems by Edgar A. Poe, 2nd edition, within 2 years he won first prize from the Baltimore Saturday Visitor for his story MS manuscript found in a bottle. Adding to the renewed estrangement with his foster father following having been removed from West Point rather than becoming an officer and a gentleman, Stern observes in his 23-page introduction to the Portable Poe that John Allen had at least one mistress who bore him several illegitimate children, and Edgar, who was apparently adored his foster mother, may have heard something of Allen's sexual irregularities and perhaps threatened to expose him. With that dedication not being the most politic way to secure the prospects of any future inheritance, the consequence, apparently, was that, following Mr. Allen's death in March of 1834, his will provided for both legitimate and illegitimate offspring, but left nothing for his foster child. Completely on his own, following a failed attempt to join the Polish army during that country's 2-year-long and ultimately unsuccessful rebellion against Russian occupation and rule, Edgar A. Poe traveled once more to Richmond, Virginia, where he became assistant editor at the Southern Literary Messenger, was fired due to drunkenness, although subsequently being reinstated after taking a temperance pledge. According to the Chronicle in the Portable Poe, it was at this point in his life that the writer's aunt and her daughter came from Baltimore to join him in Richmond, and, perhaps for purposes of propriety, living together under the same roof in a boarding house, the 27-year-old Edgar Allan Poe did the right thing and married his then just 14-year-old first cousin, who he frequently referred to as Sis, a fact that has generated a great deal of speculation with respect to whether or not their marriage was ever consummated, something which very probably will never be known. At the beginning of the following year, in 1837, Poe resigned from his $15 a week position at the Southern Literary Messenger and moved his family to New York City, where in 1838 he obtained a publisher for his only full-length work, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym describing an expedition to the Antarctic involving mutiny, shipwreck, famine, and a mix of the supernatural and the real that 20th century English poet W.H. Auden has characterized as one of the finest adventure stories ever written. A year later, Poe got a job in Philadelphia with the Gentleman's Magazine, in which he first published The Fall of the House of Usher, dealing with circumstance surrounding a premature burial, relocating his aunt and young wife, and then having a collection of stories published under the title of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, which included The Fall of the House of Usher, and for which the author was merely compensated by a limited number of complimentary copies. Taking an editorial position on Graham's magazine in 1841, Poe came briefly into a very rare agreement with the highly successful poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow by positively reviewing Nathaniel Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales. At around this time, Poe also published a work that would eventually influence the likes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Mickey Spillane, Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and John Grisham, in addition to, since 1945, inspiring the Mystery Writers of America to annually present a small bust of the writer as its Edgar Award, due to his having created their genre with The Murders in the Rue Morgue. During the next 2 years, Poe published several critical essays, such as The Poet's Vision, Genius and Madness, Fancy and Imagination, in addition to the impossibility of writing a truthful autobiography. But then his wife, Virginia, as the author described it, burst a blood vessel while singing, causing him, in his own words, to become insane with long intervals of horrible sanity, during which he drank God knows how often or how much. Nonetheless, this was also when Poe wrote a non-fiction piece titled Eureka, which inspires the scientific notion of an evolving universe, as has been dramatically illustrated by the recently launched James Webb Telescope, and that was dedicated, like a major park here in Chicago, to the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. Additionally, it was at this time that some of Poe's other most famous works were written, including The Pit and the Pendulum, purporting to be a first-person account of the nightmarish experience of a Spanish Inquisition torture victim, The Black Cat, The Gold Bug, influencing the development of cryptology through the decoding of the alleged treasure map of the Caribbean pirate Captain Kidd, The Cast of the Amontillado, and The Telltale Heart, essentially establishing an archetype for the American psycho killer. This was also when Poe began attempting to obtain funding for his own magazine, relocating his family to New York, somewhat successfully publishing his poem, The Raven, and then moving outside the city to a small cottage where his wife subsequently died under incredibly impoverished circumstances on January 30th, 1847. Drinking heavily during the following year, Poe soon proposed to a verse-writing widow who was 6 years older than himself and whose poetry he had previously published, was initially rejected, seems to have attempted suicide, but then became reconciled with his intended fiancée on the condition that he would stop drinking until, one night when he arrived at her home while heavily intoxicated, thereby terminating that relationship, although not attempts to establish various other romantic liaisons, given that at the same time, according to Van Doren Stern, Poe was making wild protestations of love to another woman who was married and living with her husband, while he also paid court to Mrs. Sarah Ann Lewis Stella, a Brooklyn poetess whose husband employed him to correct his wife's verses. Continuing to pretty much meet the criteria for alcoholism as set out in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, the DSM-5, persistent desire and unsuccessful attempts to cut down or control alcohol use, Poe traveled back and forth between New York, Richmond, and Philadelphia, again encountered Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, by that time a wealthy widow with 2 surviving children out of 4, again proposed marriage to her, this time against her children's wishes, although soon after, having completed the poem The Bells with its tintinnabulations of the human life cycle, dying under somewhat unusual and perhaps voter fraud-related circumstances in Baltimore, Maryland, after having been found unconscious in the street wearing someone else's clothes outside of a polling place on Election Day, and then dying 4 days later in Washington College Hospital at 5 o'clock in the morning of October 7th, 1849, after reportedly having exclaimed, "God help my poor soul." Of course, the story doesn't really end there. In addition to the mysterious appearance, beginning in 1949, of 3 roses and a half bottle of cognac on Poe's grave in Baltimore each year for several decades, the night of the author's birthday, January 19th, there's also the body of work that he left behind. Although dismissed by such other 19th century American writers as Henry James, who once stated, "An enthusiasm for Poe is a mark of a decidedly primitive stage of reflection," in France, the poet Charles Baudelaire, author of Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, translated Poe and wrote several critical essays about his work, stating on one occasion in 1864, "The first time I opened a book he had written, I saw with equal horror and fascination not just things that I had dreamed of, but actual phrases that I had designed and that he had penned 20 years earlier." Philip Van Doren Stern begins his introductory essay to the Portable Poe by stating, "There is a ghost haunting America, a forlorn ghost who wanders the night. That ghost, of course, is still with us. In the psycho-thrillers of popular culture, in the concept of the death wish as defined by analytic psychology, in literary theory, and in the cosmology of the Big Bang and the concept of the expanding universe, as well as deeply embedded in the awareness of anyone who has ever experienced the truth of the assertion originally made by the Raven that, outside of memory, deceased loved ones will be restored to them nevermore. Still, of course, unending desire can persist, as was somewhat jarringly expressed in one of Edgar Allan Poe's very last poems, written just a few months before his death. "It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maid there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted, her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.